Frank Fenner. I don't know if you've heard of him. I hope you have. Died this week. Wonderful bloke. Died at the age of 95. Anyone heard of him? What's Frank most famous for? Yeah, he rid the world of smallpox. All right. In the last 100 years, the world has basically rid itself of horrible diseases like smallpox through both the science and the passion of people like Frank Fenner, but also diseases like polio and nearly tuberculosis have been virtually eradicated. One of the main, there's one word for me that sums up progress over the last 100 years. One word which separates rich countries from poor countries, unfortunately rich people from poor people, and people who have some chance of enjoying the day and people who have no chance of enjoying the day. Now there are lots of things that might fit into this category, but for me the one word that sums up development is dentistry. Okay? Dentistry. You don't think hard about it, but you should. Because 100 years ago, people died. 50 years ago, people died from abscessed teeth that rotted in their heads, and then they died of simple infections because antibiotics only became common after World War II. So for me, dentistry is a wonderful word. And when you combine dentistry with another wonderful word, anaesthetic, you really know you're talking about happy people living in a rich country. Because the combination of dentistry, anaesthetic and happy gas mean that for us, for middle class people living in a rich country, we take for granted that we can solve simple problems like cavities in our teeth. But whilst middle class people in rich countries around the world enjoy the benefits of dentistry, billions of people don't. Billions of people go without food, billions of people go without clean drinking water, access to electricity, let alone comfortable, adequate housing. And the question is, of course, why is that? And what is it, if anything, we want to do about it? And if we did want to do something about it, where would we start? Well, what I want to focus on today is why it is that in a country as rich as ours, we tell ourselves we'd love to do things to protect the environment. We'd love to tackle climate change. We'd love to do something about biodiversity. We'd love to do something about marine heritage. We'd love to do everything, but just, we can't. I mean, when I say we'd love to, what I meant to say was no. It's really important. It's just not. Okay? There are just all these other things that are just far more important. Now, understand that in a democracy, that's inevitable. The point that I'll make today is that while Australia is rich enough to do anything we want, I repeat that because it's simple but true, Australia is rich enough to do anything we want, but it's not rich enough to do everything we want. And we have to make choices, we have to prioritise. And when we say things like we can't afford to tackle climate change, what we mean to say is we would prefer to buy something else instead. Now, one of the things that we would prefer to buy links back to my opening statement, which is really quite clever, really, and that's the toothbrush. The toothbrush is a modern engineering marvel. Apologies to those of you who've heard my jokes about toothbrushes before, but they're really funny. And that's what you get for inviting me back 2 years in a row. Probably 3 or 4, I really can't remember. But the toothbrush, the modern engineering marvel that is the toothbrush. Have a look at it these days. When I was a kid, which is a long time ago now, the main innovations in toothbrushes were different colours to allow you and your sister to figure out whose was who. But these days you go to the toothbrush aisle in the supermarket and there's a plethora of choices available to you. All sorts of extensive engineering's gone into the design of the modern toothbrush, driving up the price of them extraordinarily. But my favourite innovation is, of course, the very comfortable non-slip grip. that now accompanies most toothbrushes. Now keep in mind, you used to buy toothbrushes in packs of 5 or 10 in a couple of different colours, soft, medium and hard if you were fancy. And these days toothbrushes are so expensive you couldn't afford to buy them in packs of 5 or 10 because they're so well engineered and because they solve such problems like comfortable non-slip grips. But has anyone here ever lost control in the wet? Has anyone, told you it was funny, has anyone here ever had such a traumatic dental incident that you have sworn off the Povo brand toothbrushes and committed yourself, safety first from here on in, I want the full Volvo option pack. I'm not taking any chances when it comes to my teeth. Because what's happened in the last 20 years in a society as rich as ours is that we have clever people who are paid lots of money working very hard to define and identify and in turn solve a whole range of problems that we didn't used to know we had. Those problems include, of course, the toothbrush, but if you look around, you will find them everywhere. My second favourite one is, of course, that most important modern convenience known as bottled water. Now, we all know how evil oil companies are, those evil petrol stations. And I used to work at one, it's true, we used to fix the price. We used to ring the guys at the top of the hill every morning. It's not top secret. It's just impossible to prove in court. No one's ever asked me to give evidence though. So, hey, it's getting recorded. It's not too late. But everyone knows that oil companies rip you off. Everyone knows that petrol's way too expensive. Everybody knows that this is, it's all part of a big conspiracy. And everyone knows, because they think hard about it, that the price of bottled water is much higher than the price of petrol. Okay? Next time you go in and pay $2.50 for your 500 or 750 mils of water, understand that you just paid somewhere between $7 and $10 a litre for water. Fine, I don't care what you buy. But petrol is $1.30 when I filled up the other day. Those oil companies, oh, they're ripping us off. Those water companies, gee, they're refreshing. And who could have foreseen today that I might get thirsty? Who could have foreseen that? I mean, I'm a busy, powerful, very powerful here, important person, striding boldly across the country. Who would think that at some point today I might get thirsty again, like I got yesterday? Luckily, there's someone there to solve my problem at between $7 and $10 a litre. Now, the reason that people provide these services is because in a rich country people are willing and able to pay for them. And I don't begrudge you having a nice toothbrush, I don't begrudge you drinking bottled water. I'm just trying to contextualise that in rich countries we spend a lot of money on some weird stuff. And that's okay. That's called capitalism. But what it also is evidence that if we wanted to go and solve some other problems, we obviously could. And when we say I'd love to solve the problem of climate change, or I'd love to solve Indigenous disadvantage, or I'd like to see old people in Australia who are on the age pension get rapid access to dental care, which they don't, when I say I'd love to do that and it's a priority, what I mean is it's not as important as the comfy toothbrush. What I mean is it's not as important as handy rapid access to chilled water in a nice bottle with really quite interesting graphic design. Do you know where most bottled water comes from? Authorised, potable, municipal sources. You know what that means? Taps. Okay, taps. And sometimes it comes from a beautiful spring somewhere, which is the same kind of spring that goes into a dam and comes out of a tap. They didn't say it didn't come out of a tap before, after it was in the spring, that it didn't then come out of a tap. So that's okay. If you need that kind of water in your life, go crazy. If you can't imagine that tomorrow you'll get thirsty again, who am I to criticise you? But I know it's really hard to keep track of, isn't it? Someone will have to remind you to go to the toilet next. But we live in a society where we spend enormous amounts of money on this sort of stuff. I read in the paper on the plane on the way down this morning that big business in Australia isn't giving nearly as much to charity as people wish it should. And frankly, I'm surprised they give any. Their obligation, I've got no problem with this is their job. Their obligation is to maximise return for their shareholders. It seems odd that the company should hand out the money. It seems to me that the company should do its job and maximise its profit, and if its shareholders want to donate money to charity, they should. But companies like to give away a lot of money, or what they call a lot of money. But let's put it into perspective. Last year, the big four banks spent $1 billion on advertising. $1 billion on advertising. It cost $900 million to run the ABC. So if you want to sort of put into context, what it is we as a society spend money on, we've spent more money on bank ads that admit that bank staff and banks hate you, but they get you to laugh about it, which is nice. They spend more money on that than it costs the entire ABC to run a worldwide news collection and distribution organisation, because bank ads are more important in our society than the ABC. I know this because we spend more money on it. So in Australia last year we bought $1.3 trillion worth of stuff. We call that GDP. $1.3 trillion worth of stuff. And we had a pretty good year. The economy grew all right, and that meant we're about $50 billion a year collectively richer than we were the year before. It's about average. It's the rate Australia grows over time. So collectively we got a $50 billion pay rise, and collectively we spend it on all the things that are most important to us. The problems that we are yet to solve, however, include ongoing Indigenous disadvantage. The AMA says $500 million a year would close the gap, not in life expectancy, but would close the gap in the provision of primary health care in remote Indigenous communities. $500 million. We got a $50 billion pay rise last year, but whoops, when I said priority, what I meant was not as important as everything else we did. The broadband stuff, woohoo, looks like it's going to make it through the parliament. I like the internet, it's really good. But gee, $40 billion is a lot of money. Now, when asked, do you think that everyone in Australia should have rapid access to the internet, I'm inclined to say yes. But I'm queer like that. If you ask me the question, do you think everyone in Australia should have rapid access to health? Bugger me, I'd say yes to that too. And if you ask me, do you think everybody in Australia should have good access to good education? Tick, I'm in again. The problem is we found $40 billion for broadband, and that health thing, yeah, soon. Oh, people in the bush don't have rapid access to the internet. Must spend $40 billion. People in the bush don't have access to good health. Well, they do live in the bush, you know. It's a long way away. Turns out the educational opportunities aren't as great as choices. We're to take responsibility for our choices. Except when it comes to the internet, when of course, no matter where we live, we should be able to rapidly download porn and pirated music, which, by the way, the government's trying to stamp out. So again, I don't resile from the view that better access to fast internet is better than not having it. But understand that when you drop $40 billion on that, and people run around saying, oh, I'd like to tackle climate change, but where would the money come from? Gee, I don't know. The internet? We're about to spend $50 billion building 12 new submarines to replace the 6 Collins-class submarines that I wasn't sure were fixed yet. All right? Well, Collins-class submarines have sort of been around my whole adult life, from we're going to buy them, to we're going to have them, to they're going to be quiet soon, to they're not going to kill people soon, and now apparently they're gone. We need to replace them with new ones. And we need to replace the 6 Collins-class submarines we haven't used in war with 12 that maybe we will use one day. And that's okay. I don't actually think we shouldn't spend anything on the military. But $50 billion is a lot of money. And often people tell me that the reason that we can't tackle climate change is that it's a fundamental fundamental challenge for our democratic institutions. I dispute this, by the way, but it's commonly believed, even amongst many in the environment movement, that climate change is a wicked problem. It's a wicked problem. It's a fundamental challenge. Why? Well, because the costs are up front. The benefits are not just in the future, but they're uncertain. In that, we're not quite sure how bad climate change is going to be. Some people only think it'll be terrible, as opposed to the appalling, and we need to really resolve that before we can act. So the benefits are in the future, and they're uncertain, and the costs are up front, and the body politic in Australia is just such that I'm told that we can't make big, expensive decisions where the cash is up front and the benefits are long-term and uncertain. Except, of course, when it comes to submarines. Because while we're not certain who's going to invade us, and we're not certain when they're going to invade us, and we're really not certain that we'll have the submarines parked at exactly the right spot when they try and come in, it's common sense. It's bipartisan political consensus, common sense, backed up by newspapers like The Australian. It's just common sense that you'd spend $50 billion on that just in case. And imagine how silly you'd feel in 30 years' time if someone invaded and you didn't have your submarines and they weren't in exactly the right spot. So I'm confused. The benefits are in the future, the benefits are uncertain, the costs are up front. Our governments seem willing and able to make those decisions. Stephen Conroy, the Communications Minister, is adamant that we don't need a cost-benefit analysis to justify spending $40 billion, although they tell me now it's down to 30, so it's sounding cheap. $30 or $40 billion on broadband. Stephen Conroy says we don't need a cost-benefit analysis. We've had lots of inquiries, etc. By the way, the main reason we don't need a cost-benefit analysis is this new broadband internet thing is so good that we can't even imagine what the benefits will be. i.e., we don't know. But we're not talking about uncertainty. We're not talking about, the need for certainty before we invest a lot of government money. We need to know exactly what's going to happen here. In fact, when it comes to the internet, the opposite is true. The fact that we've got no idea what people are going to be doing with it in 10 years' time is the proof that we need to build it now. Because it's going to just unleash all this innovation that we can't even imagine. And again, I tend to agree. I think that's a good idea. But compare and contrast the approach to dropping 30 to 40 billion on the internet or 50 billion on submarines with tackling climate change. Oh, gee, Richard, you mean to tell me that you're not certain what the temperature will be on Tuesday the 7th of March 2070? You're not certain? And you can't tell me exactly what the sea level rise associated with that will be? And you can't tell me exactly how many people will die through vector-borne disease or heat stress or something else? You're not certain, Richard. Oh, gee, I don't think we should rush in. And it's very expensive, you see, this tackling climate change stuff. So I'm an economist. I'm sorry. On behalf of my colleagues, I apologise. They've not empowered me to do so. They're quite proud of themselves. I'm an economist, and I like economics, and I think economics can shed light on decisions. But if you look at the big decisions that our society makes, and if you look at the small decisions that our society makes, most of those decisions are made in the complete absence of the perfect and complete knowledge that we allegedly require if we're going to make a big decision about doing something about climate change. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't aspire to having good information, and it doesn't mean that good evaluation doesn't lead to better decisions. I genuinely believe it does. But let's be consistent in the way that we evaluate the way we make some decisions versus the way we evaluate the making of others. And in a $1.3 trillion a year economy, the reason you can drop $40 billion on the internet, the reason you can spend $50 billion on some submarines is, wait for it, that's not a lot of money. Okay, it's actually bugger all. 1.3 trillion, $1,300 billion per year is a lot of cash. And in the context of an economy that big, don't get me wrong, you go ask a minister for $40 billion, they'll ask you some questions first, but it's not actually an enormous amount of money in the context of the Australian economy, in the context of the Australian economy in over decades, and in the context of the evidence about the likely consequences of not tackling climate change, which is, of course, the main thing to compare the cost of tackling climate change to. What's the cost of not tackling it? And every analysis that's been done suggests that the costs are actually quite small and the benefits are actually large, which is better than we know about the Collins-class replacements, and it's better than we know about the internet. So why then, if it's as simple as I'm suggesting, and when I say simple, I mean if a majority of both houses of parliament wanted to do it, they could do it. Why, if it's so simple, isn't, haven't we got very far in this debate? And I think the simple answer is, it's got nothing to do with economics, it's all to do with politics. And I like politics. I worked in politics a couple of times. I actually like politicians. And even think they deserve a pay rise. And I feel obliged to say that because they never can. They can never actually say, you know what, that's not a lot of money to do the work we do. I don't think they should get paid millions of bucks. That would be silly. But they're not overpaid. But I like politics, I like politicians, and if you look at politics carefully, you can really get a good sense of what's going on. The problem is it's hard for most people to look at politics carefully, and most politicians are adamant that they're not interested in politics at all. They might just happen to be professional politicians, but let's not play politics on this issue. It's their job to play politics on every issue, okay? But unfortunately, voters don't like it when they admit to doing their job. Probably one of the reasons we don't want to pay them that much. See, I linked the two again. So clever. So what's going on politically? Well, the problem is we've conflated a couple of important but quite different issues. The first one is we've confused cost to some people with cost to the economy. Okay? So if I don't think I've got much money. If I lose $35 today, do a little experiment, see what happens. If I lose $35 today, and someone here comes and picks it up, what's the cost to me? $35. It's not rocket science, guys. I know economists have got you all scared. All right. Economics is not as hard as engineering. I teach it. It's not that hard. Some of it's hard, but we make it hard to keep you out of the debate. It's true. All right, otherwise you all might think, you might feel empowered to say, I'm sorry, it doesn't look that hard, why don't we do it? If I lose $35 today and you find $35 today, then I'm $35 worse off and you're $35 better off. What's the impact on the economy? Zero. Am I happy or sad? I'm sad. I lost $35. Does the economy care? No. So the first thing you have to understand, I'm going to pick my money back up now. You know what's going to happen? People like you. Wouldn't leave it in a room full of economists, that's for sure. Well, they wouldn't invite me to talk to them. It's not quite true. But, well, you've got to understand, step one in the politics of talking about climate change is the people who are going to lose some money, and they do exist, are really upset about that. And what they're trying to do is convince you that them losing money is your problem, not theirs. It's a big difference. Because people who find $35 go and tell their friends, I found $35. I don't know whose it was, so I don't even feel guilty. But someone just stuffed $35 in my pocket. It's my shout. So the people who are likely to lose money need to convince everybody else that them losing money is a collective problem rather than a private problem. Now, I'm not saying we should be indifferent, I'm not saying that we shouldn't consider the impacts on individuals, but primarily on people who own big polluting assets, of tackling climate change. Of course we should consider it, but let's consider it very, very clearly. There's a difference between them losing money and us being worse off. Step one. Step two is the implication is that, we all know that the whole Australian labour market, the entire Australian economy rests on that, enormous industry, the Australian coal industry. Now, don't get me wrong, we've got a very, very big coal industry. So big that it employs almost 30,000 people. Almost 30,000 people. Now, a friend of mine runs Uniting Care, and they're the biggest provider of aged care in Australia. Now, we're talking big business here. 35,000 people. They don't get paid as well as coal miners, but one aged care provider in Australia employs more than the entire coal industry. But of course, step two, what you don't realise, Richard, I sound like Kevin Rudd, asking myself questions and arguing myself. You don't realise that there's a multiplier effect. It's not just the people employed in coal mining, or more importantly in coal-fired power generation. It's not just their jobs that matter. There's this complex thing called the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect is where we, wait for it, multiply the sort of amount of money that I get paid by a pretty arbitrary and fixed number to figure out what the impact of my spending on the economy is. So sure, there might only be 22 to 30,000 people working in coal mining, but the indirect benefits of that are enormous because all those people spend money, etc., etc. Whereas what you have to understand is that anyone who doesn't work in the mining industry has never spent any of the money they've earned. All right? What happens to the rest of us when we earn our money is we just keep it. We don't buy food, we don't buy clothes, we don't pay rent, we don't go on holidays. So there is no multiplier effect for anyone else. It's the only multiplier that we care about is the multiplier associated with mining jobs and agricultural jobs. The simple reason for that is they're the only people that bother to go and spend a lot of money paying my colleagues to calculate the multiplier effect for their industries. So step one, conflate cost to me with cost to you. Step two, exaggerate the implications of what I do. Again, I'm not saying that tomorrow we should sack 30,000 coal workers and that we should sack everyone who works in coal-fired electricity. What I'm saying is that over time, we put the right policies in place, the number of people employed doing those things will decline, and here's the really hard bit, other people will get different jobs and they'll have multipliers too. All right, but we don't talk about that. We just want to keep the argument simple so that it supports our argument that it's too expensive and that we shouldn't do anything. So step one, conflate my cost with your cost. Step two, exaggerate the size of that cost. Step three, create sort of emotional arguments about devastating particular communities tomorrow. Well, I hate to break it to you, but the coal-fired power generators and the mining industry in Australia have historically not been known as the worker's friend. I grew up in the Hunter Valley in Newcastle, and BHP sacked 20,000 workers in Newcastle when I lived there. 20,000 workers in Newcastle, the equivalent of going to 20 high schools and saying to every kid at every one of those high schools, one of your parents just lost their job. That's a lot of jobs out of a town. I don't remember BHP at the time saying that jobs were the most important thing. And I don't actually begrudge them for that, because their job is to make cash for their shareholders. So step one, there have been regional communities that have been devastated by change in the past, and some of those changes have been enacted by the companies that at the moment are telling us that that would be the end of the world. Also in the Hunter Valley when I was growing up, the number of people working in coal mines fell by half. Half of coal miners in the Hunter Valley lost their jobs in the 80s and 90s. Anyone know why? Yeah, longwall miners, this giant bit of kit that, you know, what it did was it just chewed through jobs. This giant bit of machinery shredding jobs as it went. Because what you used to do was have a lot of people down there and you get to stand behind a big longwall miner and it just goes. Has anyone ever seen one? Huge. All right, and it just goes straight through a coal seam, conveyor belt behind it, out you go. Fine, good. I'm all for technology. I'm all for productivity growth. Let's just be really clear. What cost half the coal miners their jobs was that the coal miners employed a new bit of technology. And no one was talking that much about jobs at the time. They were talking about national benefits. Right, here's the irony. When they sacked half their workforce, they said, don't look at their costs, look at the impact on all of us. Yet when I say, hey, let's tackle climate change, they say, oh, you can't talk about all of us, you've got to talk about me. Bit weird, really. So, but profitable. So, does anyone here think for a minute that if we do nothing about climate change and someone comes up with a completely robotic way to mine coal that's cheaper than employing people to mine coal, that the coal mines wouldn't employ the robotic bit of kit and sack the other half of their workforce? Of course they would, and I don't begrudge them doing it. There's this evil job-destroying technology that I'm sure I talked about last time, but I must remind you of this pernicious technology that's just destroyed working families around Australia called the digital camera. Because once upon a time, hard-working Australian families saved up money, spent $250,000 buying the local photo development lab. Suckers. Bye-bye. You know, you're gone. Nowadays you're trying to sell some picture frames. Good on you. All right? Technology comes along and changes things and people lose their jobs. And I'll come back to what I said before. We should. I've spent my working life saying we should be concerned about people who are displaced through no fault of their own. As I said, I grew up in the Hunter Valley. I was working as an economist up there when this stuff was going on. My research was on how we could provide better transition and adjustment packages to the steel workers and the coal workers that lost their jobs. And no one cared that much about those people back then. So I'm not suggesting for a minute that we should be indifferent to the fact that people lose their jobs when things change. But I think it's bizarre that the one word that never came up in the climate debate in 2008 and 2009, the one word while the so-called emission-intensive trade-exposed industries were on talking all the time. They talked about they talked about certainty. I'll come to that in a second. They talked about jobs. They talked about regions. They talked about communities. They talked about exports. They talked about everything except one word. What's the one word you never heard them say? Profit. Not once did they come out and say, the reason we're opposed to you putting a price on pollution is that will reduce my profit. It must have slipped their mind. In their newfound concern for other people's jobs, other people's regional communities, they completely just lost took their eye off the ball there for a couple of years. And every public utterance seemed to neglect the one thing I suspect it's their job to care most about, and that is their profit. So why in a country as rich as ours, in the year 2010, do we tell ourselves that we can't afford to do things? How funny is this? We can't afford to tackle climate change. I hate to tell you this, good climate change policy makes money. I'll repeat it again. It's radical stuff. Good climate policy makes money. When you put a tax on cigarettes, you don't hear many people saying the government can't afford to do that. Oh, they're going to increase the cigarette tax. That'll drive them broke. You put a tax on cigarettes for two reasons. One, you're trying to discourage people from smoking, and two, you raise a bunch of cash. If you put a tax on greenhouse gas emissions, you make lots of money. That's the point. That's the plan. The problem was that the CPRS, which I'm glad was voted down, actually gave away more money than it made. It was the first ever loss-making tax. And I'm not kidding. There's so much evidence of this, but the most public and easiest evidence of this is that one of the reasons that the CPRS was abandoned, and abandoned in the timing that it was abandoned and with such bad sort of media management, was that in the lead up to the formation of the 2010 budget, the Treasury was saying to the government, look, you've got to make up your mind, are you going to do this CPRS or not? Because if you're going to do it, we've got to put it in the forward estimates of the budget. But the funny part is, if they took the CPRS out of the budget, it freed up billions of dollars to spend on other stuff. Because the CPRS lost money. It was the carbon price that actually gave away so much in compensation that it cost the government money. So I repeat, good climate policy makes money. If you put a tax on the things you're trying to discourage, and you spend the money, some of it, on the things you want to encourage, you actually wind up with money left in your pocket. We calculated earlier this year that if you took a $23 per tonne carbon tax and didn't give any of it away in compensation to polluters, you got a $23 per tonne carbon tax, raises about $13 billion a year in revenue. You could post every household in Australia a cheque for $2,100 every year. We suggested calling it the Carbon Christmas Dividend Cheque. Just send it out at the time of year when people most appreciate getting their cash. Now, the average home spends around $1,000 to $1,200 a year on electricity. At most, the introduction of a carbon price would increase that bill by 20%. It's more likely to be 10%. So if you spent $1,200 a year on electricity, and if it went up by 20%, you would be how much a year worse off? $240. I can post you a cheque for $2,100, and that assumes that you use the average amount of energy, not less, and it assumes that you're not willing and able to do anything, including spend last year's cheque for $2,100 on some energy efficiency kit. The only reason that you might be worse off as a result of the introduction of a carbon price is if the people who really will be worse off get so much money in compensation that there's nothing left to give to you. Which is why they want you thinking about how bad it is for them rather than how good it could be for you. Because if I leave $35 on the table and you find it, it's a good day for you and a bad day for me. If we take $13 billion off the people who pollute the most and spread it out evenly across the economy, only a very small number of people will be worse off and a very large number of people will be better off. And even if you didn't care, we might actually do something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we can afford to tackle climate change for two reasons. One, we've got heaps of cash. We just choose to spend it on weird stuff. And two, we think tackling climate change will be expensive because we're listening to the very narrow, very selective and very exaggerated assessments of how much tackling climate change will affect some people, and we're being told that that's actually going to cost us, when actually we're primarily talking about a transfer. Just one last point. The so-called, and as I said, I just think slap a simple carbon tax on. It's not rocket science, and if the price isn't high enough, increase it next year. But people will make it sound a lot harder than that, and that's fine. But the opposition's assertions about this great big new tax on everything, I'm told that this is such a killer blow rhetorically that it's very hard for the government to fight it. I'd just like to remind you that it was the opposition that introduced the GST, some would argue a great big new tax on everything, and that Tony Abbott went to the last election suggesting that we should increase the tax on cigarettes so that we could raise revenue to spend it on health. He also went to the last election saying we should increase the corporate tax rate so that we could afford to pay paid parental leave. So I'm confused about how hard it is to have a fight about the need to impose a tax to solve a problem. It's actually quite common and it works. But most importantly, keep this in mind when you're thinking about the polluters and you're thinking about compensation. Imagine if we had a regime that imposed a tax on cigarettes, but anyone who bought bulk cigarettes by the carton didn't have to pay. Because effectively that's what people are saying we should do when it comes to a price on pollution. We should have a price on pollution, except for the big polluters. Oh, you pollute a lot. Oh, it would cost you a lot. Oh, I misunderstood. Oh, allow me to compensate you then. Because somehow I thought we were going to tackle climate change by aiming at the small polluters. So it's not that hard. It's not that expensive. But the politics are what stands in the way. And the politics are quite simple. A small group of people are going to lose a lot of money because they own assets that do nothing other than pollute. They've known this for decades, and every day they can delay change is a profitable day. They're not going to give up. Why would they? I don't blame them. But if we keep waiting or we try and compensate them so much, compensate them for the inevitable and desirable consequence of the policy, then that's the reason there's not enough money to go and make everybody else feel like it's actually a good thing. So Australia's rich, which is good. Australia can afford to waste money on crazy stuff, which is good. But I don't think we can afford to not tackle climate change because the consequences are just so big. So there are lots of reasons to do nothing about it. But my final point to you is that money isn't one of them. So thank you very much.
But we do have time for about 10 minutes or 5 to 10 minutes worth of questions. So I've got a whole lot in my head, but I might throw it over to you guys. What I might get you to do is just repeat the question for the camera. But does anyone want to kick us off? Front row.
I work in science and engineering and waste management stuff, and it's quite real to me. Economics is very much based on faith.
Yeah.
Can you comment on like, the whole thing is a fiction based on our belief in a system that could collapse if we stop believing it?
Yeah. So the question is, for someone, an engineer who works on tangible things, economics seems like it's all based on faith, and it's based on faith in two different ways. A lot of economists have incredible faith in a particular theory of how things should work, despite enormous evidence to the contrary. Truly, like economists assume, for example, that all people make rational decisions all the time. Now, I'm sure everyone here does, but you probably know someone who, for example, thinks that they do research at the Pons Institute, and in turn you're willing to pay huge amounts of money, they're willing to pay huge amounts of money for moisturiser. Or, anyway, would never work on you guys, you're too smart. But there are other people out there that make some clearly irrational decisions. But the faith you're talking about is actually about trust in each other. We have very complex systems where to some extent we all have to agree in advance to keep doing certain things. And if all of us, or if half of us stop doing what the other half expects us to do, the system can and will fall over. And that's what effectively happened with the GFC. It should have sort of ground to a halt much sooner, but people had so much faith that other people would keep doing stupid stuff. I mean, truly, the GFC came about because a whole bunch of banks were effectively lending money to people to buy houses, even if the people buying the houses clearly couldn't afford the house, clearly couldn't afford to make the repayments, and clearly the house wasn't worth the amount of money that was being lent to it. But as long as everyone was doing it, it was okay. So, yeah, look, I think one of the big problems, the reason I like to talk to groups like yours, is that economists have got a role to play, but it should never be a dominant role. And here's the thing, I don't think it is a dominant role. It's just that economists are like witch doctors who, that's my favourite metaphor for what we do. Historically, witch doctors didn't run the show, they just explained the show on behalf of the king. Or queen, or whoever's running the show. So, king wants to have a war, witch doctor rip open the chicken and finds a spot on the liver, and as luck would have it, it's a good time for war. We should go to war. It's not the king, it's the gods. They're telling us we have to do it. Well, economists have got a language that's sort of so impenetrable that when you say things like, well, surely in a country as rich as ours, if we really cared about Indigenous disadvantage, we would have solved it by now. Oh, yes. It's a lot harder than that. I'm going to bore the hell out of you for half an hour with things you don't understand. Oh, you're still here. Oh, I'll keep going. So, my point is it's designed to be impenetrable. And in a democratic process, people should just, feel free to ask hard questions. If it doesn't make sense, people should say so. No one knows what the Hang Seng Index is. All right? No one. It's on the Channel 10 news every night. Do you think anyone who cares about the Hang Seng is tuning into the Channel 10 news to find out what it's doing? Truly. No, this is important. What's it doing there? It's reminding you that smart people who understand stuff you don't get are off making important decisions. So just, get a grip on yourself. You think we might want to spend more money on health and education. Well, that's nice, but you're wrong, and something to do with the Hang Seng is the reason why. Sorry, I'll try to be more brief with my next one. Yeah, it goes back. Richard Stone was the American economist who, along with Kuznets, probably played one of the biggest roles in the development of GDP. And when it was getting developed, yes, Kuznets was saying that stuff in the 60s, but when GDP was getting developed in the 40s and 50s, Stone and others were saying this should never, ever, ever be used as an indicator of anything other than how much stuff we just made. All right, so it was never designed to do anything other than tell you how much market activity there was. It's a very, very good indicator of how many market transactions there were. It's just a terrible indicator of everything else. But in the absence of something else, it's become used as a proxy. Look, the Australia Institute, where I work, published something called the Genuine Progress Indicator in 97 and 2000. I was involved in those projects. I've been involved in what, to some extent, in most of the projects that try and come up with another number. I hate to say it, my conclusion after 20 years of playing in this space is it's doomed to fail and is a good thought experiment, but a terrible sort of idea to be implemented. I hate to sound negative. That doesn't mean we should stick to GDP, but it's actually impossible, I think impossible, to get community consensus on how to attach weights to things like environment and income inequality and nice toothbrushes. Truly. So, and you cannot avoid the need to make a weighting if you want to have an index. And if you avoid the weights, then you've just got an implicit weight of treating them all evenly. So my view is that it's actually a dangerous distraction to go down that path. And what we're doing at the Institute, here's my plug for the Institute, all our research is free. It's all available online. And if you just put your email address on our website and or our Facebook page, we'll tell you about our research. But one of the things we're working on at the moment we call measuring what matters. And to cut a long story short, I think we need to give up on trying to define and measure success and focus exclusively on defining and measuring failure. Because I think if you avoid failure, you've got a chance of succeeding. So to cut a long story short, I think rather than try and define our progress towards a sustainable transport system for Melbourne in 2050, I think give up. You'll never do it. No one knows what it means. If you were doing it in 1990, who would have thought up the internet? Right? Who would have thought up the mobile phone? How can you possibly say what Melbourne's transport system should look like in 2050? But why not say what you don't want it to look like? And if it's getting worse, you know you're failing. So frankly, I don't care how many bike paths got built last year, and I don't care how many Priuses are on the road. If there is more passenger cars on the road using more fuel than this time last year, policies are failing. You know, you don't actually have to define success to have a very clear notion of failure. So, look, GDP is a very good measure of something very irrelevant, and, well, irrelevant for most people most of the time. It has impacts on your life very indirectly, but I think it's not actually achievable to replace one dumb number with one great number. I don't think we'll ever get the great number, and if we keep working on that, people are going to mock our number rather than pick on the really dumb one. I'll try and be short. He's so polite.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your entertaining talk. I had two questions specifically about about some features of the presentation. The first was when you were giving the example of the zero-sum game and using jobs as your example for the emissions-intensive trade exposed emissions-intensive trade exposed industries as they call. My question was, when you were doing the calculations for that, did you also look at the arguments that state governments would give in terms of royalties and the tax revenues, how that would affect the overall economy as well? Being mindful of what you were just saying about GDP. So that's the first question. The second is, in giving a price on carbon, which is the sort of fashionable thing to talk about at the moment, what's your opinion of the success of that versus simply stopping fossil fuel subsidies, which we do to the tune of about $9 billion every year in various forms? Would that not be a more successful way? I don't know. I was just wondering.
So first question was basically, in talking about the costs and the benefits of putting a price on carbon, what about state government royalties and things? Yeah, look, absolutely we looked at that. But again, it's inconceivable that you can put a new tax on something and raise less money. So even though royalty revenue might decline slightly, it's more than capable of being offset by the huge growth in the revenue from the carbon tax itself. That said, I don't actually think the carbon tax is a be-all and end-all, but I think it's a very, very important step. You said, what about fossil fuel subsidies? I actually wrote a little sort of 9-point plan a little while ago, and the first thing on my list, so maybe this is a Dorothy Dixer, but the first thing on my list was remove perverse incentives that are actually currently encouraging people to use more fuel than they should. we have something called fringe benefits tax concessions on company cars, which literally give you a bigger tax concession the more you drive your car. This tax concession costs $2 billion a year and actually is the main form of assistance to the Australian car industry. The direct cash that the car industry gets is small. The real money that Ford and Holden get from taxpayers is indirectly through the FBT tax concessions, which encourage huge numbers of people to buy big dumb cars that they never pay the fuel bill for. 90% of Commodores and Falcons are purchased by people who don't pay for the fuel that goes into them. And 40,000 kilometres after they're bought, they're sold second-hand at very low prices to people who do pay the price. So, yeah, look, step one is stop doing dumb things, but, you know, I can give another talk on the other 8 steps. It's a very good point.